In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at how we're going to work with APIs. So for this class, there is an API that I've created that allows you to manage a to-do list. The API URL is located in your assignment, so it's this API URL. So here's the API description. So for this class, Spring 2020, there's an API key that I've created, so all requests will have to utilize this API key, and I'll show you how to use that here in a second. But really, this API contains three different services. The first is when we use an HTTP GET, and we're hitting the URL tasks, and we embed our student ID. So I have a few tasks that I've created, so I'm just going to copy this URL, and I'm going to bring it over, and I'm looking at my ID, and you'll notice that I get a forbidden message. The reason for that is because I'm not using my API key, but that's one of the URLs that we'll use is tasks, and then part of the URL will be your student ID. So that's the first part of this API. The second part of the API is we're going to be creating an HTTP post. So our request has to be via a post where we're going to hit the tasks URL, and our content type header has to be application/JSON, so it'll only take JSON requests. And then our HTTP body has to be in this format. So we're passing an object that has a student ID, which will be your student ID, and then a description of the new task. So if I want to correlate this to your project, there's an API that will take a new task and insert it into a table. So the user is going to type in this new task. You're going to send that new task along with the API key, along with your student ID, to create a new task record in that API service. Okay, so that's via an HTTP post. And then finally, the last service that this API provides is the ability to delete a task. So again, the verb that we're using is HTTP delete. We're going to go to the same URL. And again, the content type has to be application/JSON. And then we're going to say which student ID owns the task and what task in particular do we want to delete based on the description. So in order to do that, if we go back over to the project, you'll see this little trash can. These are actually buttons. So what's going to happen is the user will click on a button. I have to take out the trash as the description. I have to pass along my student ID, and then I also have to use that API key in order for that to function. So what I want to do is I just want to walk you through how this API is going to work. First things first, I like to use a tool called Postman, and Postman allows me to create requests based on those HTTP verbs. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire up Postman. It's a standalone application that allows me to make these HTTP requests. There's a native app. I still use the Chrome app. It's fine. I'm going to clear all of my previous requests, and you'll see that I was kind of testing this out before. So what I want to do is I want to do an HTTP GET to this tasks URL. And then in the headers, the content type, there is no content type, but there is going to be an API key. And if I skip back over to that other tab in my browser, it says that all Spring 2020 API requests have to use this API key. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it into Postman. Okay, so that's the API key that I want to use. Okay, so I'm just saying give me all the tasks, and if I'm doing an HTTP GET, I want to get all the tasks for a particular student ID. So I'm using my employee ID. I'm going to send that, and eventually, so it has an initial startup time, so we're seeing a little bit of delay, but you'll see I have a couple of tasks. So the tasks are items. I have my student ID, a description, a student ID, and a description. And it tells me the record count and the scanned count. So I'm getting data back from my service. Okay, so now I want to go ahead and add a new task. Okay, so I want to change this to a post. I want to change it so that I'm not passing the student ID in the URL anymore. I still need the API key. This time I need a content type for the body. And then my body is going to be an object where I have a student ID and a description. It's raw data, and over here I've selected application/JSON. Okay, so when I send this task, and my headers are already set up, so I'm using the same API key, my body's passed, I'm going to send it. What's going to happen is if I insert it correctly, the response is going to be an empty object. Okay, and eventually you'll see that I get a response back that's an empty object. That's confirmation to me that that record was inserted. And we can go back and test that by going back to this request. So over here in the left, we have the history. I can send that same request again, and you'll notice now I have 3 tasks in my task store for that particular student ID. Okay, so then let's say I wanted to delete that eat pizza. Okay, so I want to delete that task. So I'm going to change my request to a delete. I no longer am embedding the student ID in the URL. The headers, I have the content type and the API key. And then the body, it's the same exact body. So which student ID and which task. I want to delete the task that has a student ID of that matching student ID and the description matching eat pizza. Okay, so I'm going to send this delete request. And eventually I get confirmation back with an empty object saying, hey, that task was deleted, so that task has been removed. I should be able to then see that, so I can go back to my history, and I should see just the 2 tasks left. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to show you how we'd create an XML HTTP request using these HTTP headers. So specifically, if we're looking at the headers, we need to have an XAPI key. To pass the API key, we have to have a content type to indicate that the request body is going to be JSON. And we need to have the API key for the get, the post, and the delete. We need the content type there for both the post and the delete, but we don't need it for the get because there is no request body with an HTTP get. Okay, but this Postman is a handy little tool that I like to use to make sure that my API is working and that I understand how I'm going to interact with the API before I start coding in JavaScript. Okay, so now that we know how the API is going to work, what I want to do is I want to bring up Atom, and I'll create a new file. It looks like I have to install an update. I want an HTML page. And my HTML page will be interacting with APIs. And then I'll have an external file, script source, apis.js. And I'm going to save that on my desktop in a new folder called APIs. And then the file name, just index.html. Okay, so this is what we're looking at. And the idea is that I should allow the user to create a new task, because I just want to go through the new task process with you. And the reason I'm only going to do the new task process with you is because this is going to touch on all the points that you need for the project. So we need to pass HTTP headers. We need to be able to pass the request body. So what we can do is we'll code that here. I want a text field for the user to be able to type in a task description. So I'll have an input, type equal to text, with an ID equal to task. And then I want a button, type equal to button, with an ID equal to new task. And then I want to wire up my JavaScript, so I'm going to go ahead and add that new file, apis.js, window.onload equal to init. And then I'll have a const init, which is going to be a function definition where we wire up our button. So I'm going to use document.querySelector. We called it new task. We'll add event listener for the click, add new task. And then I need a function to add that new task. So here's a constant, add new task. It's going to be a function definition. And I just want to make sure things are wired up correctly, adding a new task. Okay, so if everything's wired up correctly, I should be able to see this button click event handler when I open up this HTML page in my browser. I'm going to go inspect. Looking at my console, I click on the button and you'll notice that I get my little description here. What I want to do is I want to wire that up so that this button then passes the information that the user typed, like eat pizza. So that'll take that information that the user typed, it'll pass it over to my API based on my ID, and it'll insert that task into our task data store. Okay, so the way I want to do that is I'm going to use the XML HTTP request object. So let XHR equal to a new XML HTTP request object. I need my URL, which is going to be the API URL. So I'm going to jump back over to my browser. I have the URL right here in the address bar. So that's the URL that I want. I have an API key that I'm going to grab. It's part of the URL. Or it's on that HTML page where that URL is located. So that's my API key. And then we know how the XML HTTP request object works. So eventually what's going to end up happening is we're going to open that request. And we're going to do that. Since we're using add new task, we always specify the method and then the URL. So in the past, we've always used HTTP gets. But since the API requires us to post data in order to insert the record, this is going to be an HTTP post to our URL. Then eventually we're going to send this request. This will change too, but for now we're just kind of going the old-fashioned route. And then we're going to have a callback, and then the way the callback will work is xhr.onReadyStateChange equal to some function definition if the XHR ready state is equal to 4, and XHR dot, well, I'm not even going to do the status. I don't know if the API is wired up to send a status code. So the ready state's equal to 4, then we know that we've gotten confirmation back, right? So we can say, okay, new record was added. That's the idea. Okay, so now most of this is fairly good, but when we do the send, this is when we have to send the information that we want in the HTTP body. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. If I go back over to Postman and we're looking at a post, this is our insert. We set up our HTTP body, so we sent this object with a student ID and a description. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hard code my student ID in here. So I'm going to say let student ID equal to. Okay, so this is my student ID. Yours will be different. So I'm going to hard code my student ID in there. The description I'm going to get from the end user. Okay, so the way I'm going to get the description is if I go back over to my browser, the description is going to be the value in this task text box. So what I want to do is I want to grab that information. So I'm going to say let task description equal, and again I'm going to use document.querySelector. I think I called it task.value. So So I'm just grabbing the value of whatever the user typed into that text box. Okay, so I have the two pieces of data. I just need to move it into an object. So I'm going to say let params equal. And the way the params work is I want to match them exactly. So you'll see student is uppercase, the I is uppercase, and then description is uppercase. So I want to match that exactly. So I want to say student ID is equal to the student ID that I have above, that variable, and then the description is equal to the task description. Okay, so those are the parameters. And the way I want to handle this is I want to send those params to the server. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward how I send the HTTP body. The other thing that I have to do is I have to set a couple of request headers. So if I go back over to Postman and I go to my headers, I had two headers here. I had the content type and the API key. Those are the two headers that I had. So I'm going to go back into my code, and this XHR has a set request header method. And it takes the header name. So in our case, we want to set the content type and then the corresponding value. So our request type is going to be JSON. And then we have to set another request header for the XAPI key. And our XAPI key will be this API key value. Okay, and if this is all wired up correctly, then I should be able to insert a new task, and we should be able to get confirmation back that a new record was added. We can also confirm it through Postman that our new task was added successfully. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to go back over to Chrome. I'm going to reload my page. I'm going to say I want to eat pizza. And before I add this task, I just want to go back to Postman to confirm that if I do my HTTP GET, we only have 2 items in the collection right now. So I'm waiting for my response. I have exactly 2 items. I have walk the dog and pet Maddie. Maddie's the dog. So now I'm going to bounce back over to Chrome. I want to add a new task, which is eat pizza. We can watch the network traffic. So that's one thing that's really helpful in the developer tools. So when I click on add new task, we should see that request. And for some reason, I'm not seeing that request, which is bad news. And if I look at my console, you'll notice that I'm getting an error, set request header on XML HTTP request. The object state must be opened. So I had set the request header before I opened it. So these request headers right here has to happen after I open the request. We can try this again. So eat pizza. And again, I like to look at the network traffic to make sure that the request is happening. But if there's errors, I have to skip kind of back and forth between the network traffic and the console. But now you'll notice that I do have network traffic. It tells me that that's pending. And eventually I get a response back. And you'll notice that I get an error. 1 or more parameter values were invalid, missing the key student ID in the item. Okay, and the reason why is because the way this API works is it will not allow me to send the parameters as JSON. I have to use a method that basically I have to send the parameters as a string. So I'm going to use this method JSON stringify. So I'm converting that JSON object to a string. I'm going to stringify the parameters, and then life should be good there, I think. So let's refresh this again. Again, I'm watching the network traffic. I'm going to say I want to eat pizza. I add the task. Eventually, I get confirmation back that there's an empty object, meaning this was successful. Okay, and then if I go back to Postman, I should be able to send this request asking for the tasks. Oh, and I need the tasks for a specific student ID. And you'll notice that eat pizza shows up in my task list now. Okay, so to interact with this API, The only thing that we're going to be doing differently is we're going to be setting some request headers. We are sending an HTTP post as opposed to an HTTP get. We'll deal with gets, we'll deal with posts, we'll deal with deletes, we might deal with puts if we're doing updates, but those are the different HTTP verbs that we'll deal with. So we're dealing with new HTTP verbs, we're setting request headers, and then we are sending data to the server in the send request. So in the past we've just said send, or we've said send with null, with no values in there. This time we're going to send those HTTP parameters so that we can insert a new record. Okay, so for your project, you're going to have to expand on this so that you're adding tasks, you're deleting tasks, you're listing tasks. One challenge that you're going to have with the project is that you should only call the get all tasks when the page loads initially. Meaning, if I add a new task, I have all the information to render that task on the page already. So right here, I get confirmation that was added, then I should just update the user interface with this task object. Okay, I don't need to reload the entire page to get all the tasks. I have all the tasks except for this new one. So what I want to do is I want to just take this new one and append it to my existing list. Same with the delete. If I delete one task from a list of 10, I don't want to reload the entire list. What I want to do is I just want to remove that particular task that should be removed, that's being deleted. Okay, and then the timing of that is a little bit tricky. I want to wait until I get confirmation that it was successful. So what I'm doing is I'm looking, is there an actual object there? Okay, so it's an empty object that is my confirmation that it was successful either adding the new record or deleting the existing record. Okay, so just a couple of new options that we're going to have with the XML HTTP request object.